Okay, it looks like we are on. Hello and welcome to Landscape Ontario's Town Hall, brought to you and organized by the Landscape Ontario COVID-19 Task Force. Today's Town Hall is being recorded. The recording will be sent out so that you may review it as your own unique schedule allows. Please ask lots of questions. There is a chat function to the right-hand side of the screen. So please ask your questions there. I'll be monitoring the chat so that we'll be able to get to as many questions that you have, and we'll do our best to get to as many as possible. Our federal government has announced emergency relief measures for individuals and businesses. Following the announcements, there have been extensions and amendments. Navigating the details and the nuances of these programs definitely takes some focused time and effort, especially being able to digest and summarize in a way that the people that work for you may understand and actually apply. Given where many Landscape Ontario member businesses are at in their season, that time is a precious resource. The LO COVID-19 Task Force felt strongly that we make the topic of our next town hall webinar exactly that and talk about the details of those programs. And here we are today. My name is Joe Salemi, and I am Landscape Ontario's Deputy Executive Director. On our panel today, joining me, Alan White of Turf Systems, our Task Force Chair. Dave Wright of Wright Landscaping, our Landscape Ontario President.
Good evening, everyone.
Jeff Olson of BTN Nurseries, on Landscape Ontario's Board of Directors and our Task Force. We also have very special guests with us today, Judith Andrews, Commissioner of Employers at the Canada Employment Insurance Commission, and Julie Garner, Principal at Earnscliffe Strategy Group. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I know that Julie was having a little bit of technical issues. Judith, are you still there with us today?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
We can. So we'll kick it off over to you. Why don't you start and tell us about your role and help us key in on some of these programs that we're anxious to hear about.
Okay, well, great. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and it's really a pleasure to be with you here at Landscape Ontario's Town Hall this afternoon. When your kind invitation arrived, it reminded me of the last time I joined in one of your events, your fabulous conference and trade show at the Toronto Convention Centre. So I know these things are happening remotely these days, but I have to say how happy I was to hear that your industry was among the first to get the go-ahead to reopen and to continue to do your wonderful work. As was mentioned, my current role is as Commissioner Employers at the Canada Employment Insurance Commission. The CEIC was created exactly 80 years ago this summer, courtesy of a constitutional amendment that allowed the provinces to cede their natural authority over labor market matters to the federal government. This happened in the wake of the Great Depression of the 1930s, when the idea was to create a national unemployment insurance system. Fast forward to today, and some people and some think tanks are saying that the economic retraction caused by the current pandemic has shown that the EI system doesn't work, that instead Canada needs a universal basic income scheme. Of course, this isn't actually fair to say, since no one had a system ready to receive millions of unemployed people, given that just a few short months ago, the burning issue was a shortage of qualified labor. So the present CEIC is a tripartite departmental corporation of the Employment and Social Development Canada, and it has representation from the sitting government in the person of the Deputy Minister of ESDC, who is also the chair of the commission. And then there's a commissioner on the labor side and the commissioner for employers. That's me. The CEIC holds responsibility for the oversight of employment insurance and related files such as labor market information and labor market development. Job Bank and the Social Insurance Register actually fall under our wing, and commissioners make regulations under the Employment Insurance Act, We make agreements with provinces and territories worth over $2 billion to do labor market development. And we monitor and assess the performance of employment insurance through research and by preparing an annual report to Parliament. And also among our official duties, we annually set EI rates. That's normally something that happens over the summer, and you hear the good news or the bad news, depending on your perspective, in the middle of September. We set the maximum insurable earnings and the premium reductions for firms having a short-term disability plan that actually takes a load off of EI sickness. So the commissioner employer's role is to represent employers in the EI system, for which employers actually finance the lion's share, 7/12. Employees pay the remainder, 5/12, and government pays zero into this usually $22 billion system. In doing this work, I'm fortunate to have the input and guidance from your industry. Landscape Ontario and your mothership, CNLA, are valued members of my office's business liaison group. I often speak of your industry as doing everything right. You've learned how to elongate your season. You use sub-plans to help top up employees' EI benefits and keep them connected to your companies. In your frozen months, especially, you undertake professional training. And it was your industry that obtained the last Red Seal trade, a Red Seal apprenticeable trade. So you've done an awful lot to vault the reputation of your industry, a seasonal industry that uses EI properly and effectively. During the present COVID-19 urgency, my office has been in regular communication with employers through their associations, conveying information and taking note of business questions and issues regarding the relief programs, particularly the ones in our purview, such as the CERB, which is the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, and EI work sharing. The COVID emergency legislation gave Employment Minister Carla Qualtrough superpowers to modify EI in the pandemic emergency. The modifications have been accomplished through a series of interim orders, and these interim orders are consulted with commissioners, although we do not sign off as we normally do for regulations under the Employment Insurance Act. At the outset, it was recognized that employment insurance is actually quite a complicated program. There are a lot of very fiddly rules in it, and it's founded on an old technology platform that frankly simply couldn't withstand the unemployment and millions of unemployed people that was caused by governments shutting everything but essential businesses down. So EI was effectively paused, but people who had built up EI entitlements, those have been held safe for after the CERB ends. CERB was exactly the kind of lifeboat needed for the pandemic emergency. It's a simple money program, $2,000 per 4-week period, all based on an attestation. It got money out the door quickly when it was needed. The trick will be to ensure that the CERB lifeboat does not actually become a houseboat, that we segue off CERB and back to EI how and when appropriate. This is an area where I'm offering advice from the business side, so your input is welcome on that. I'm told that CERB creates disincentives to work, making it hard for firms to ramp back up to normal. There's also the problem that CERB top-ups are not allowed, unlike EI subplans. And there are no tools in CERB like working while on claim and so forth. So it is a simple money program without tools and actually without much in the way of integrity in terms of making sure that eligible people get the benefits. And of course, we've just had an announcement of a further 8 weeks of CERB, making it a full 24 weeks available in the window through to October. I just turn for a moment to EI work sharing. Right away when the pandemic hit, there was swift action to modify EI work sharing with special measures. It used to take 30 days to turn around an EI work sharing application. That was reduced by 2/3 to roughly on average 10 days. EI work sharing special measures that extend for a year from March 15 involved an extension of duration from 38 weeks of work sharing to 76 weeks of work sharing. The EI recovery plan used to be a fairly complicated thing. It's been vastly simplified to a single line of text in the application. New one-year businesses are eligible. You used to have more experience in business, but a one-year business is now eligible. Also, work sharing allows flexibility to bring back staff as needed. You don't need to bring back everyone at the same time. Plus, training while on work sharing is allowed under a relatively new policy, probably about 3 years old, passed by the Commission. So whether you want to do training for COVID protection or other necessary training, that is certainly allowed while on work sharing. And that's something that my office is working to try to develop more modalities for, that could help work sharing be used in the recovery ahead. I'll say a little bit about the CEWS, the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy. That particular program was actually not out the door first, and it's my understanding that the government actually would prefer more people to be supported under the wage subsidy program, and in fact, it was budgeted at a much larger amount than was the actual take-up. The trouble was CERB was out the door first. People were laid off or furloughed onto CERB, and it was really difficult to unravel that plan and bring people back onto payroll and have the CERB repaid by your employees so that you could put them onto wage subsidies supported by CEWS. So the CEWS has undergone a consultation recently. They're looking at a whole range of things, I think. And I took the opportunity when that consultation was on to identify something that was troubling with the CEWS, and that was that it sideswipes EI work sharing in terms of the level of support for wage subsidy allowed. And I don't know if I can get into the details further down the road, but the main problem is that the CEWS calculation requires EI work sharing benefits paid to employees to be summed up and deducted from the CEWS entitlement. That's not an easy task because employers don't have that information and have to gather it from each employee, so it risks being wrong and problematic. But it also effectively, especially for the firms that need work sharing the most, it effectively negates the kind of wage subsidy support that they really need and should be receiving at this time. So I've made a recommendation in that regard to fix that sideswiping issue. And as well, our office supported the CEWS recommendations that the other groups in all the groups in our business liaison group were recommending, including things such as dropping the revenue eligibility threshold, which is seen as particularly important as businesses open and revenues start to increase, and also adjusting the subsidy from the current all or nothing approach, and making the CEWS access a little more broad to include startups and firms with joint venture structures and a variety of other things that are legitimate business arrangements, but somehow don't qualify under CEWS. The other thing we've argued for is informing employers in advance to give them some predictability, particularly for the hardest hit sectors, tourism, hotels, and cultural events, and so forth, that they'll be able to take advantage of the CEWS longer. And some business groups have suggested October 15 or December 31st as extension dates for that. And a variety of other things, including something that will be near and dear to your hearts, the adjusting the program to make sure that seasonal workers, internships, and part-time jobs are eligible. So the other thing that's problematic with the CEWS is that it's time-consuming and complex, and it gives rise to concerns about errors and mistakes and subsequent audit jeopardy. And so I have taken the advice of the Canadian Payroll Association on some of these administrative things that could be improved to make the queues more acceptable. So the notion here is to try to get more people using the payroll support, fewer people using the money program with no strings attached, and of course, where needed, segueing over to employment insurance, and also using EI work sharing as necessary to help get back to normal. And so those are some of the things I've been thinking about lately. I have some details about these programs. I understand that your membership is pretty far up the learning curve in terms of the particular eligibilities and so forth. I know that Sally Harvey asked some very pointed and useful questions around eligibility for your sector in a session I held with some CRA officials. And so I think you've probably got some of those details, but we can get into them later if necessary. Anyway, that is what I would like to say in opening, and look forward to hearing all of your views on all of these things, as it's my job to try to make sure that your message is heard internally. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Judith.
Thank you, Judith.
And trying to navigate all of this, and knowing kind of the details as you pull back the curtain, help us understand the complexities. As Peter said in the chat, it quadruples our appreciation for the work that you're doing. So thank you. I will open it up to the panel. Alan, Dave, Jeff, do you have any questions for Judith?
I'd like to ask one.
Go ahead, Jeff.
If it's okay. Great info, Judith. Wow, that was amazing. My question is about the Student Summer Jobs Program, and that seems to be one that I thought was going to be great, and it just didn't seem to take off. Do you have any familiarity with that?
Not very much. I did actually refresh for this evening's webinar a set of links that I have. Joe, did you circulate those earlier, or do you want
They have not been circulated, but we will make sure that those documents that you did fire over get posted on our resource hub, and we'll definitely send out, along with the recording of this webinar, we'll send out links to those documents that you provided.
Okay, because if you're talking about the Canada Emergency Student Benefit, is that what you're speaking of?
No, I'm talking about the Canada Summer. I think it's called the Canada Summer Jobs Program. Julie, maybe you know more about it than me. I think that's what it's called, but it's supposed to be 100% funding if you're hiring high school, university age students. But it kind of fell flat for our company anyway.
Yeah, the challenge with that one was the Canada Summer Jobs Program. The intake for that is typically February and March of a calendar year. And so COVID-19 hit, of course, I mean, it hit earlier, but of course flipped our country upside down in mid-March. And so it was one of the first announcements the government made that they indicated that for-profit companies could qualify to have 100% of the wages for these students covered, which was amazing. It was 50% before, which was obviously a huge help. But they never really opened up the intake again for people to be able to apply to create the opportunities. What I can say is it is a pretty fantastic program, even when it's running at its normal course. And there could still be a bump to 100% pay next year, given that there will be likely still kind of a need to get more people into the workforce. This is not going to disappear overnight. So I think the best advice I can offer you on the Canada Summer Jobs Program is watch and have your people watching for the intake timeline in February and March, and get your applications in. I know in a lot of the areas, it's also worth touching base with the local representative, because There's certain areas like Toronto where the program's really oversubscribed, and then there's other areas like the region of Waterloo and others where people aren't taking aren't doing the work to get the applications in to the same degree.
Yeah, I can maybe
Thanks,
add to it, Judith, while you're on the call here. Thank you for taking the time today. I've participated with you numerous times at the national level, CNLA. So your expertise and your representation for this sector nationally in Ottawa we're immensely grateful. So again, thank you. This Canadian Summer Jobs Program is kind of a double-edged sword in the sense, as you alluded to, Julie, the intake is typically February, March, which predated COVID. So not only most of our anticipation of workforce need kind of floating on previous years' history or historic nature, but also these summer students, as I have 2 teenagers in my household that normally have summer jobs. Those summer jobs are unavailable this year. But I know lots in this sector, because particularly the landscape sector has, from the garden center, the nursery growers, and even in the landscape maintenance and design build, are just inundated with work. It's kind of and I'll ask some questions later as it translates into 12 and 24 months. But right now, the majority of our memberships, because everybody's home, is incredibly busy. And we could utilize some of these summer students, but just getting access to them or getting them up with CERB there, not having access to these summer job programs has had a significant impact on us. And I anticipate will repeat itself in the coming months as we see this all transpire. And also the way the government, the federal government that you work closely with, how much money is available. So it's kind of a weird situation that, though we're anticipating economic turn down, why we're anticipating the impacts of COVID, the government's done such an incredible job of propping up the economy that there isn't an eagerness to work, even though unemployment's at its highest ever. There isn't a tightening of people spending because there's this massive inflow of cash into the marketplace with very little strings attached. But our anticipation of what's going to transpire in the future and how much is government looking at, it's great that we extended it 8 weeks, but August is going to come, and most experts are saying this is going to continue into next fall, next summer. Does our government have a plan? And as we come to the end of our season, are we looking at or having a collaborative effort to kind of really anticipate where EI, CERB, and other things are going to come into play by year's end?
Joe, that might be a great segue over just to provide a little bit of intel in terms of where our firm is, and then keep going with the questions.
Yeah,
about that.
sure.
Sounds great. So why don't we hand it over to Julie, and she can provide some insight there.
Sure. I really appreciate the opportunity to participate again. My name is Julie Garner. I know I was introduced at the beginning, and I belong to a firm. I'm a partner and a principal at Earnscliffe Strategy Group, which is a government relations, public opinion research, and communications firm. We're a national firm where we have offices across the country. I'm part of our Toronto office, but work, even pre-COVID, out of my home most of the time in the Kitchener-Waterloo area. I've been working alongside with Landscape Ontario, originally starting and seized with the challenges that you're facing in the snow and ice industry around the insurance questions and problems. And then when COVID hit, really switched gears to kind of getting you back to work and getting your industry back to work and opened up, as well as to kind of navigating some of the government programs. And so this is the second Landscape Ontario webinar that I've participated in. The first one was very much that educational dump of, what is CERB, what is CEWS, what are all these really crazy acronyms that are coming out of the federal government that are supposed to help us, and where are the holes that need to get plugged. And so it's been a really interesting period of time since March, in terms of just taking in the information, being able to communicate it out, but also being able to be really interactive with government. And I'm fortunate, Judith has access in her role that is really unprecedented to mine. But in this period of time, there's been much more interaction and dialogue back and forth with government about the shaping of these programs. and the ability to kind of go back to the drawing board if we haven't gotten something right. So it's been good. Not everything's fixed, not everything's perfect, but it's been in real time where we've seen problems that we've been communicating in from industry to kind of solutions, or at least responses that they're on it, they're working at it, they're looking at it. And I think one of the most recent examples of that is the CEWS program, the $40,000 loans. Now it's not out the door, but when that program was initially announced, it had the payroll threshold that you had to meet in order to qualify for the program. There were many businesses and business owners that called on us and called on other groups that I'm part of and said, we pay ourselves in dividends, so we don't have a payroll that hits the threshold, and we want to qualify for the program. And that question was brought up almost daily on calls with the federal government, and lo and behold, they did find a fix, or at least propose a fix, to allow those with dividend income and smaller businesses to qualify. Now, that program has not been actually launched yet. It was supposed to go live last week, and it hit technical difficulties. Judith and I were speaking about this in a preparation call. We do know that the banks are balking a bit at some of this, and part of the challenge, other technical difficulties, it's not totally clear what that is, but at this point in time, we do still have a resolve from government to roll this out to smaller businesses. As far as kind of our kind of company goes, and my role with Landscape Ontario and just role with clients in general, it's really to try and navigate government. And at this point in time, I think it was you, Alan, that said it's never been more important to really understand how these programs are going to impact us. And so really it's been a lot of a translation, and also kind of knowing who to talk to get the right answers. And in many respects, I think Judith's been serving that function for you as well, in terms of getting the answers and getting your questions to the table and in front of the right people. And so it's been a real privilege, especially during this time when these questions mean so much in terms of the livelihood of jobs. Where I was going to segue in is that our firm, certainly we are very connected into government in terms of our colleagues across the country. We've been sharing information regularly amongst colleagues to be able to serve our clients better. And there's a number of updates that have been coming. And I said to Joe in our pre-meeting that this is a great kind of inflection point where things are changing. We're going to be in September before we know it, and these programs are going to have to do what Judith was talking about, is start to get people off of the lifeboat and back to work, so it doesn't become that houseboat that she referred to. And there are a number of kind of planned and things that are sort of being thought about and changed. Now, this is not gospel. Things can change, and we've seen them change very rapidly, but I can give you some insight in terms of what I'm hearing on some of the programs that'll build on what Judith is saying. CERB would be one of them, and certainly I think Judith has covered it really well, that they're looking right now at the 1.3 million people who have left the program, trying to figure out where they've gone so that they can figure out, is there something that they can replicate there to get more people off of the program. And they are now kind of, obviously, they had proposed some legislation which would have some penalties in it for those that have been offered employment and refused it. That was not supported by any of the opposition parties, and without a majority status, they did not go forward, as that would have been a confidence motion. So that is dead in the water, and CERB's been now extended until the end of August. What they're looking at, I think Judith touched upon this, is really how do we shift people in? It looks like they're looking at a model that will shift people into the EI system, so maybe modifying some of the EI criteria in terms of qualification to get them onto that program, which then enables, it has a time limit to it, but also enables, things like work sharing and as well, SUP programs, and also just that kind of, if you are offered a job, some of those kind of termination points, which will solve some of the issues that are plaguing some employers at this particular point in time that are trying to get people back to work. As far as the CEWS program goes, they just wrapped a consultation. We touched a little bit upon that. Judith's group was actively part of it. We have heard that they are very much seized with this issue around kind of a very significant kind of cliff that in terms of the revenue decline that businesses have to meet, the 30%, in order to qualify for the program, at least for the two pay periods. What they are looking at is some way to have a much more gradual decline for that program that doesn't disincentivize success or growth, that allows people to perhaps recover some of those 30% of month over month over month that they have been experiencing, and also know and have the certainty that they're going to have some support there while they do it. So the sloped off ramp is something we'll be watching very quickly, and certainly from many of our clients, that's what they're looking to see. They don't want to be penalized for having a decline in revenue by 28% instead of 30%, when that's going to have material impacts on potentially some staffing decisions that they make going forward. And that's the adverse outcome that the government wants to see. The last program I'll touch upon before kind of turning it back to the Q&A, which is really going to be something that that Judith and I are going to engage in, and the rest of the panel members, but is the commercial rent subsidy program. It was rolled out in Ontario with a joint sponsorship of the federal government and the province. It has not yet been a success. I don't personally expect that it will be. It's got some criteria in there that are highly problematic for landlords, and then tenants cannot apply on their own. The revenue decline as well is 70%, and so that really knocks out companies like many of yours that have continued to operate, albeit many at a loss during this period of time. So not a successful program. They're still studying it. The provincial government in Ontario has just banned evictions, and they do expect that will have an incentive for landlords to apply for the program. We have not seen any data yet on it. They're saying it's too early, but we do expect that there may be some changes coming to that program, as we expect it to be undersubscribed. That's the last program I'll touch base on right now, but happy to answer any questions. Certainly have a broad spectrum of kind of knowledge on all of them, including kind of some of the issues and discussions and debate going on around migrant workers, which has obviously been a huge subject in the media right now in the Windsor area, as well as some massive outbreaks in the Norfolk County area. So thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Would love to turn it back over to the panel. I'm sure you guys have some questions that you'd like to throw over to her. So, Dave might start with you.
Sure. So one of the questions that that kind of comes to me and what I'm experiencing is we are in a labor crunch still. My company we're hiring, but no one's applying. The two guys that I have hired in the last 2 weeks, one of them wasn't eligible for one of the programs or didn't look very far, so he was working, and the other one came right from a job and didn't have an issue jumping. But the government support is in some ways giving people a crutch that they may not necessarily need, but they don't mind it, so they're not working. How do we get people back to work? How does the government plan to do this?
Well, I mean, right now, it doesn't look like there'll be measures coming that I've seen. Judith may have other comments on it, that will be able to help businesses that are struggling to find people right this minute. The program changes are expected in the fall that will start to kind of make it and put some penalties in place in terms of not accepting employment when employment is available, as well as exiting people off the program. They want to do it again in a sloped manner, so it's not a cliff that all of a sudden one day 2 million people are being supported and having their families supported by the program, and the next day they're destitute. So it will be a gradual. Unfortunately, it's going to be a challenging labor market, and we're experiencing it ourselves. My husband's business is in landscaping. We also have a food truck, and we can't find people to work either. So I hear you, but I'm not seeing anything in terms of tools right now to get people back into the sector.
And part of the problem is like $2,000 goes a long ways for a student who normally would have taken a job for the summer, but this summer doesn't need to, because they can make $6,000 over the summer without doing anything, and that's a problem, because that's part of our workforce. Obviously, we're paying them more than that, but they're getting tax taken off, whereas from the government they get a check that doesn't have the tax taken off. So they're getting a larger lump sum in their pocket, and it's I don't know, it's hurting. Like, I could hire 10 guys tomorrow, and I would if they were there.
No doubt.
So
Yep,
sure
Judith
can.
here. Can you hear me? Yeah. One of the things that, and I was going to talk about the student emergency benefit, and when the Prime Minister announced that, he also announced in the same breath that students would want to be going on job bank and looking for opportunities. So I just want to remind everyone that jobbank.ca is the spot where people are supposed to be looking for work. So I hope you're posting your jobs there, or through a job feed that has a deal with Job Bank, because that's part of it. On the CERB front, I've said it's a money program, no strings attached, and no integrity. I should say there's actually probably a little more integrity associated with the slightly less than half of it that's delivered through the EI system. So our antiquated system is actually serving pretty well. It was modified to deliver CERB to people who are probably EI eligible. So it was able to be done simply without a lot of manual intervention and so forth. But there is a biweekly reporting like under EI, and people are saying that they didn't work, and have been searching. So there's a bit of an attestation going on there. And so there are some tools, of course, in the EI system to make sure that people don't quit their job to collect benefits and actually refuse to come back. So there's some debate about how much that can be levered to make sure that people are accepting the opportunities that are coming their way versus languishing on a benefit. So the CRA part of CERB has, of course, none of that. But I'm given to understand that like the interim order that will be passed to extend the CERB for an extra few weeks, the extra 8 weeks. You might want to watch that on the Canada Gazette and look for that as well. It sounds to me like they're associated on the CRA piece of the benefits. So it's not. I think the government doesn't want to have the no strings attached benefit. I think they'd like to have at least some strings, but they want it also to be there. And my recommendation, of course, was for the CERB to continue for people who need it for sickness, quarantine, immune compromised people. It's got to continue to serve for that. You probably heard an announcement a few weeks ago saying that the federal government was going to press for an additional 10 days of paid vacation, or paid sick days. And that it came as a big surprise to me, because quarantine and sickness is actually covered. It was the first thing that was done. It was covered under EI, and it's covered under CERB. And so anyone getting sick on account of the pandemic is actually covered, and CERB covers self-employed people as well. So all of you in that category, we don't want to see anyone having to go to work sick or potentially contagious. So that it's covered for that. So there's a few things that CERB could continue to cover for down the road, but ideally we would want people to segue over to EI where they have entitlements and of course actively be looking for work and not having refused a job or quit a job. So that's the thing I'm pushing for, and I hope that by you're continuing to press in that direction and to post your opportunities on Job Bank and to raise these issues where you're having trouble getting people, that would be helpful.
Joe, if I could maybe just ask you the question that follows along that thought line. I've heard it from employees more at the beginning of the year when they were on CERB during a temporary layoff, but you mentioned a few times in your comments there, Judith, that if an employee gets sick or goes into the 14-day quarantine, yes, CERB covers them because of the no strings attached. And I wouldn't even necessarily go out on a limb and say that all people working right now, some aren't double dipping because there's no string attached piece. Mostly in the sense that once you apply for CERB, it automatically kicks you out a 4-week check that you reapply for monthly. What should we be anticipating as employers, also helping our employees that might qualify if they go into a 2-week quarantine, get a check for the month? What should they expect with some of the news talk media around how much they should be setting aside, how the repayment goes? Because I sense there's going to be a whole bunch of auditing coming, unfortunately for us, in our off season when the employee has very little pay or could be potentially on EI. Just your thoughts or guidance to us to educate our employees on the way to navigate that.
Okay, so again, for public purposes, the CERB was talked of as one program, but it's actually, as I mentioned, split into two. In fact, on the website there was a triage for people to kind of head into the direction of the EI portal. So, and they do operate differently. The Service Canada portal that is based on the EI modalities operates on a bi-weekly basis with regular reporting, that reminders that come, and people they don't have to, as in CRA, you have to go and present your application for your next 4 weeks of benefits. In EI, it's kind of more automatically run, just like EI would be with the bi-weekly reporting. And that actually fits the 2-week quarantine way better. So I've heard some talk about trying to have it all set up on bi-weekly basis, which would help employees in those circumstances, help employers in those circumstances. It's clear that if an employee is back to work, if it was on a bi-weekly basis, it would be a little easier. There wouldn't be so much to have to be repaid, and it's more predictable when you're coming back, and not necessarily collect for that 2-week period, that sort of thing. So I think that is the plan, to sort of lessen the number of people having to make repayments and work it on a bi-weekly basis, which also serves the sickness quarantine imperative better as well.
As a follow-up to that, Judith, knowing that we're seasonal, and I think the sector has done a very good job of extending out our seasons, but this is a super unknown, and we're all anticipating a second wave. Hopefully it hits our sector anyway at a time where it actually works out. The spring wasn't too bad. We're between winter and our spring startups, so it could have been much worse being at a time like now. But do you anticipate, as even CERB kind of just, it happened overnight, not a lot of thought went through. Some of our workers coming out in the spring automatically got moved from EI applications, or some were running out, got automatically bumped over into CERB. Do we anticipate, now that we're working on this, that there'll be a cleaner transition from CERB back into the EI system? And do you anticipate any implications as we're looking as employers forward to this winter and planning in our workforces to make sure that we are preparing properly for what you see ahead, obviously, is having a front seat at the discussions going on right now in Ottawa?
I take your point about the suddenness of what happened in March, and in fact, what they did was they picked the date March 15 if your EI claim had been established prior to March 15, you were on EI, and some people still are. But if it was after March 15, you were immediately moved over to CERB with your EI entitlement kind of held in abeyance in case you needed it down the road. So the what could happen in the fall with a potential second round of this horrid thing? I think there would be better preparation. I know right now the department ESDC is working on well, first of all, they've got something in the order of 6 million records of employment forms that have been filled by employers and sent in since the middle of March. That's an incredible feat for employers to have done that. I really do commend you. It's a horrible form. It's the worst form that bothers business. Since I've been in the business world, I've actually had a project to try to change that record of employment system into something called e-payroll that would be so much better, would mesh with your own payroll systems and not have you trying to shoehorn your payroll into the boxes on the record of employment form. But anyway, that's for another day. But so employers have filed 6 million ROEs, and there's lots of work going on internally to try to match the CERB collectors under the EI system to the ROEs that are on file, and make sure that if those people remain unemployed, they would be able to, without great difficulty, move over to EI and with the least possible manual interference in the claim, because that's the big problem. Of course, our system isn't built to have and the thing that slows claims down is the manual interference. So if they can clean up all the records and make sure that people can get on to EI properly without having to have a manual treatment, that can allow our system to handle many more people. So I think there's a ton of work going in right now to get ready for a potential deluge, but I'm hopeful that there will be more people that get brought back. I know your industry's back, but there's lots that aren't. So people that get brought back onto payroll through the queues and maybe using EI work sharing are ramping back up to normal. So the fall, I think in the fall, having been through this once, it would go more smoothly, and we would certainly be able to communicate more information to you to help you get ready. But what firms did about filling those ROEs at the time, starting in mid-March, was absolutely wonderful.
The big one, if you could, in your future meetings, is keep an eye on the sub program. A lot of our members do utilize that. We're a little uncertain what's happening with the ones that were rolling off sub, because a lot of our employees that were on it completed their sub program the end of March, even though mid-March all of a sudden they got moved over to CERB. So under CERB they wouldn't qualify for sub, even though they're still receiving sub payments. Moving into this fall, I think again it's the interaction of the different programs that you have, and I know you keep an active eye on it, Judith, but that's an important one for our members, and one that obviously needs integration. We've struggled with it in the past, how EI would change things that wouldn't change with the supplemental income plan. CERB's further complicated that. So again, I know intents are good, but we just want to make sure the widely used program doesn't cause conflict with. It's most importantly for the employees too, because as they navigate through this, there's already significant uncertainty as they go through it, and most employers don't like going through the process. We want to make sure it works before they get there.
Well, you make that's a wonderful point and a great question about the sub top-ups. As you know, that's under a registered plan with, the sub part of our department that registers those plans, and it goes with EI. It actually, you're not supposed to be topping up, or if you are, it cannot exceed more than $1,000 in a 4-week period.
Yeah, you had mentioned that in March 15th they got cut over, or anybody applying after, but our workers that were on it over the winter got cut over automatically too. I think the whole EI program got put on pause, and people that were on claim even got moved over. Again, all that happened
They
without.
weren't supposed to have been. I was told, and I can check into this again, or if you've got examples, but if the claim was fully established under EI before March 15, it was an EI claim and sub was allowed. It was after that that was the problem. Can you still hear me? My screen has blacked out here for some reason.
We can still hear you.
Okay. Anyway, but sub plans on top of CERB are forbidden.
Yep.
I have not been able to secure an answer as to why that is. In fact, the Prime Minister explicitly encouraged firms using CEWS to top up the other 25% if they could. So top-ups were explicitly encouraged under the wage subsidy program, which is actually a little bit more generous than the CERB. But for some reason, registered top-up plans that normally would have happened under EI are not allowed because it's CERB. And this point has been made strongly by many organizations, both on the employer and employee side, and it was made again today at the very highest level in our department. And it is a policy decision by the government not to allow those top-ups.
Right. Thank you, Judith. It looks like Jeff is just back with us. I wanted to get over to, no, it's all good. I wanted to get it back over to you. I know you might have some questions, so I'll give you the opportunity.
I just wanted to take a little different angle and talk about severance during this time. I'm sure that every company's got some employees that or some companies may be in the position where they have the opposite issue, where you need to permanently terminate some staff, and how's that playing now with the severance rules? And for longer term employees, what tools do employers have to save some cost in severances? Is there any opportunities there?
Julie, you might have.
I might just take this one and start off, and then certainly I'm sure Judith will have an opportunity to chat. So in terms of employment standards, really the pieces of legislation, the orders that have been passed protect employees more. So I had a call about this today where somebody was indicating that they knew a team member was abusing the system and needed to kind of potentially let them go. We were discussing it at length. One of the challenges right now with COVID is how you treat your employees is going to reflect on you reputationally. And so making changes to your staff and your permanent staff during this time should be taken very cautiously and with eyes wide open, that it could bite you, come back to bite you, and say if people say that they were fired unjustly during this particular point in time. Every firm has to do it. In fact, ours had to do some changes as well through this time, and things happen, but you just have to keep your eyes open. There isn't really an ability to sort of save costs. There hasn't been any changes with respect to eligibility for termination or severance pay for kind of regular term employees that I'm aware of in these circumstances. And but there are rules in terms of who does qualify for severance, and your payroll does have to be over the $2.4 million threshold.
I think when we go along those lines of what Jeff's asking is, some companies are in the opposite, or we could get there in the fall time as the economic reality starts to kick in, where we have to downsize. I'm hearing in other sectors as well. If your management team or some of your long-term staff has been with you for a while, but you have 10 people on payroll and you really only need 5, obviously because you don't have the sales, you don't have the economic stimulus within your company that you've enjoyed for the last 10, 15 years. It's kind of a double-edged sword too, because of this employment standard now because of the situation you're in, navigating massive severances, while at the same time trying to take care of your employees and not bankrupt your company. So again, any guidance there? It's not the norm, but I don't think we've seen the significant impact of of the disease, we haven't seen the significant impact of the economic fallout of this.
Again, Judith may have some other, technical points in terms of how the system works, but I would point you probably towards the loan program and say if there are those kind of operational pressures that may be a source of revenue that can help you pay those extra operational costs. Alleviate some burden. It is payback, but there is that $10,000 forgiveness if you can pay it at the end, which could offset some of those costs.
Awesome. Judith, any thoughts?
Yeah, can you hear me? The Canadian Payroll Association had done some work on basically the employment standards, labor standards across the country, to look at when a temporary layoff becomes permanent, and in which case, it starts to it attracts the parting monies, and so there's been some effort to try to it's not usual times, and if people were laid off temporarily but there's still hope of bringing them back, then it would be a hard thing for the employer to come up with the parting monies, the severance and so forth. As Julie said, I don't think any of the actual rules have changed on that in terms of employment or labor standards. And of course, there's the standards at law as well. I don't think there are very many opportunities to save money, but there is the potential if you're still hoping to keep people, you don't want it to look like. And you don't want it to be a permanent layoff, even if the rules in your province suggest that the certain number of weeks have gone by, that it is permanent. So that's the contribution I can make on that front. The other thing is, if you have decided to reduce pay to people, there's a certain level at which it becomes a constructive dismissal, and that could attract problems for you as well. So again, it's something that you need to approach carefully with your eyes wide open and a view to the future and your company's reputation, as Julie mentioned.
Yeah. Now, is there any discussion with the government? I know you both said this, the rules haven't changed, obviously, in government and the legal. Well, nobody's even had the ability, with courts being closed, to test anything legally. But to deal with this new reality, COVID-19, a pandemic of this size has never happened to the world economy, or particularly to Canada, to help mitigate this, because you're right, there's a whole bunch of things that just didn't play into something being this long. So employees that are on temporary layoffs, at some point those temporary layoffs become constructive dismissal, downsizing, or having to, as you see, some big companies like airlines will go to their workforce and everybody's wages get driven by 25%, but there's a point too within workforce, you take that hour down, trim wages, it becomes constructive dismissal again, when a company doesn't have the ability to pay the historical severances that the courts have allotted over the last 25 years. Is there discussion? Are those discussions ongoing or even on the table with employment standards, with the business reality we live in? And government's been pretty active on the employee standpoint to making them a whole. Is there any discussion going on the employer side?
The only comment I can make is that. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Judith.
I was just going to say that, from my perch at the commission, this is really the other side of our department, and then that would be labor standards pertaining to companies under federal jurisdiction, airlines and interprovincial concerns and so forth. So the action for you at Landscape Ontario would be with the Ontario Ministry of Labor. And so that's where the discussion should take place, and I'm not directly involved in that. I do know, though, that the Payroll Association did write about this notion of what becomes permanent to Ontario actually passed some rules that they thought were pretty good, and they commended them to other jurisdictions. So, there's a little bit of the fine example following sort of thing that can happen, but generally speaking, what you're talking about is representations to the Ontario Ministry of Labor.
Thanks, Julie. You had a comment?
Yeah, the comment that I was going to make is the kind of the time clock that you're referring to was extended in Ontario. They passed at the beginning of June an order because it was looking like I think it was mid-June there was going to be about this time a massive amount of people that had that their clock had run out, and so they did extend that through under an emergency order for non-unionized workplaces. Unionized workplaces often negotiate lot longer kind of periods of layoff and different terms, and so they were not impacted by this change.
Awesome. Thank you both.
Well, just let me, can I just say one thing about that whole piece? As employers, be very careful. You are going to see more discrimination cases, more human rights tribunals, due to this, situation, and there's lots of lawyers out there right now looking for lots of work. So just keep your eyes open on how you're treating employees as you exit them out of the business if necessary.
Good comment, Jeff.
Absolutely great advice. Everybody, thank you. Brings us to the top of the hour. Judith and Julie, on behalf of Landscape Ontario, the membership, its COVID-19 task force, thank you. And thank you for the important information you shared with us today. We know it's a very busy time as government works to provide solutions for Canadians, especially in the face of the pandemic. Landscape Ontario does have a bank of information, though, specifically dedicated to providing timely and relevant information related to navigating COVID-19. So if you do visit our website, head over to the Resource Hub and you'll find a massive, massive bank of information. And in fact, in the next issue of the LO magazine, all members are going to receive 2 decals, which will act as reminders to don't let your guard down. And we've all worked very hard to mitigate the risk and exposure for ourselves, our family, our friends, staff, and clients. So it's really important to remain diligent and remember that safety is still our #1 priority. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, ladies.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Don't let
Appreciate
your guard
the
down.
support.
Yeah.
Bye.
Take care.
Good luck with everything.